Okay, so we kind of already touched upon the second question, but in your opinion, what factors contribute the most to climate change right now?
So I'm going to do the policy part. So I'm going to jump in here because there's no question that the major contributor is our burning of fossil fuels, right? So 2/3 of global emissions are coming from heating and transportation and electricity and industry. And so we have to do something about fossil fuels. So that's the major, and this is proven by science that in fact the we know quite clearly that CO2 has been rising. That there are observations as well as some of the climate models that Doug and Tom have been talking about have confirmed that not only is our greenhouse gases rising, but they're tied with particular temperature profiles, and we have to do something about fossil fuels.
I guess I would like to add to that 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 we also need to think about population growth. That this is part of in my opinion, it's part of the greenhouse gas problem. That Michael Mann's, hockey, some of you may have seen or heard about his hockey stick temperature profile, that the shaft of the stick is pretty flat and the blade goes straight up, and that's the recent temperature over the last few decades. That's the same shape as global population growth. So there's differences in per capita greenhouse gas emissions between developed and underdeveloped countries. But I feel, that population size and population growth is also a really important, it's an important part of this problem that we face.
So I could pick up on that because I think it's also fundamentally underlying all of this. I mean, I think we can look at causes of climate change at various scales and also certain levels of sort of abstraction, right? So Sherry is absolutely correct that the number one most immediate cause is carbon emissions, right? Carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, right? Primarily from the burning of fossil fuels, also from forest clearance and land conversion, industrial agriculture. There's a number of causes. If you take a step back in terms of abstraction, we have to think about, well, what's driving that, right? So population growth is certainly one of those. But as Doug says, population growth is one thing, consumption is another, right? Those are related, but they're not exactly the same. And so we have to look at the unevenness, the global inequities in terms of the contribution, right, of climate change and land conversion, right? Carbon emissions and consumption. And those are related to wealth, to factors of wealth and poverty and kind of global differences. So I think it's very important that we're attentive to those underlying social and also political systems, right? So if we think about what are the underlying systems that drive patterns of consumption, patterns of production, patterns of greenhouse gas emissions, then we have to start looking. We look at population, we look at carbon emissions and fossil fuel consumption. We also need to take into account political and economic systems that drive these. And we have an economic system, industrial capitalism, which is inherently expansive, right? Capitalism is inherently growth oriented, right? Our very measures of economic growth are focused on expansion of the economy. So how can we continue to meet people's needs equitably in ways that don't expand quantitatively the amount that we consume, but that actually increase human welfare and environmental sustainability? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have, is thinking about how do we create a more equitable world, a world in which people's needs are taken care of, and at the same time provides for environmental sustainability and reduces climate change.
Okay, so in the aisle of addressing these challenges, what kind of sustainability slash climate change policy do you believe is necessary and realistic?
So everyone would like a single bullet of a policy, right? That answers the question and draws us to a solution that gets us to global warming of no more than 1.5 degrees C over pre-industrial levels. And that's a challenge, right? Getting there. And there's no single bullet of a policy solution, nor a single solution to all of the mitigation needs that we have. And so the question becomes, how do you get to the most ambitious goals possible? So we want to achieve a global it's a global problem, right? As Tom points out, there are certain inequities in the system. Poor countries want to grow, rich countries want to continue doing what they want to do. All of our growth has been dependent on an energy system that has been tied with fossil fuels, and all of our technological improvements have allowed us to do things a lot more with fossil fuels. And in the process, we've created a lot of greenhouse gases. And so, how do you pull that back? And one of the big questions is, what level of risk are we willing to take? Climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. Adaptation, because we've already put a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. It's up there for 100 years or more. And so a lot of it is baked in. And so a lot of the changes and a lot of the impacts are baked into the system in the carbon that we've already put into the atmosphere. We can't all of a sudden suck it out. If you think about it like a big bathtub, we, the atmosphere, and we can continue to put more water into the atmosphere. You can turn off the spigot, but you got to figure out how to reduce the total amount. And the only way to do that is to try to take some out of the atmosphere. That's one solution we have to aim toward. But we also have to put out less greenhouse gases. So how do we get there? How do we make some of those decisions? What's the risk associated with it? And there's been a lot of conversation about this. There was a big meeting today by the Biden administration about what we do, what's our level of ambition on a global basis. It's a collective action problem. It's a global commons. The atmosphere doesn't care who put the carbon up there, but not everybody's affected the same way by the carbon pollution that exists. And so how do you deal with that equitably? That's a global, negotiation that has to occur. And the goal there is to be as ambitious as possible. And so the Biden administration is in a very difficult place, trying to figure out how to convince the rest of the countries that we're serious, because we weren't for a few years ago. And we were serious a few years before that, but how do we convince those countries that we're serious, and then and get that global ambition? And that ambition is driven partly by what the scientists say are the needs, which is we have to keep global temperature below 1.5 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels, which is about 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a fairly extensive ambition, and it requires us to figure out, how soon do we put on the brakes? How quickly. The sooner we act and the more ambitious we are, actually the least costly it is. If we wait, the costs get bigger, because now we got a bigger problem to deal with. And so the most ambitious targets are those designed to bring emissions down quickly and efficiently. And now the second round of stuff that you do, so you got to have policy aimed, that has to be connected with a domestic policy agenda that helps you figure out how to address your emissions the most efficiently in the marketplace. So you have to get the reductions at the most cost-effective way, and that's hard. And you have to take into consideration the damages associated with those costs. So the social cost of carbon is really an important dimension of figuring out what is an effective cost. And then you have to figure out what are all the other types of things you can do. They range in a number of different dimensions in scale and in sector, in agriculture and in industry, and investment systems have to change, and our financial systems have to change, and we have to incentivize purchasing differently and consumption patterns differently. All these things have to play in together. And so it's an all of the above strategy. And what you see, which is, I think, is really encouraging. I was in the Obama administration in the early days, and from 2009 to 2011, where we really tried to do a cap and trade bill. And the challenge is that now we have a whole associated list of problems, that like economic recovery and the pandemic and climate change, and trying to do those simultaneously is the name of the game today. And the reason is because we can't afford not to, in the short of it. And in fact, most of what you'll hear from the Obama administration, from the Biden administration at the onset, are things that are, what some would call low-hanging fruit, things that are politically acceptable. The infrastructure bill. We have to think about, not locking in to particular technologies and strategies that we can't get out of over the long term, or that don't lock us into particular types of emissions, and eventually, end up in a worse situation that we're in, kind of like the highway bill in the 50s. We're stuck with a highway system. So the answer to that is, you got a lot of cars on the road. Now your only answer to that is to change all of those into electric vehicles. There may have been a better solution possible if we didn't have that infrastructure locked in. But now we have to change to electric vehicles. Those electric vehicles only get you part of the way to the answer if they're tied with electricity system that is powered by renewables. And so those things are connected. And turning the current clunkers we have running on fossil fuels into EVs is going to take, some 20 years or more to change that system. So all of the above have to be done. So it starts with probably with a price on carbon, some regulatory stuff, some investment strategies. We have to invest in research and technology and science and technology, because we don't know everything, and we have to invest in new technology. A lot of new technologies are going to have to come online, particularly those focused on pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, because that's the only way you get to net zero. And so all of these things have to be put into place. It's an all of the above strategy, and it has to have some political might behind it. And so unfortunately, what's efficient to an economist isn't politically acceptable in a lot of circumstances, and isn't realistic. And so there's a lot of realism built into the political choices that we have to make. That's a long-winded answer to a policy, but it's a big problem, which is, how do you put all this stuff in this basket? And at the end of the day, I'll leave with this, which is what one of my favorite colleagues, who's always put the problem like this, which is, how we decide and how we decide and when we decide what to do is a little bit like, driving a car towards a cliff in the fog. How soon do you put on the brakes? And in fact, the sooner you put on the brakes and the more pain and suffering, like I said before, that you do early on is actually less costly and more effective. You're not going to run off that cliff if you put on the brakes now.
you. Do